In other news, Ukraine launched the largest drone attack of the Russian capital overnight. According to Russian authorities, 11 drones were destroyed over Moscow. In total, 45 Ukrainian drones were reportedly downed across Russian territory. The latest attacks come as the incursion into Kursk continues. This Wednesday, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council says negotiations with Ukraine are off the table. For more, we can bring in Samuel Ramani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Now, when Ukraine started this incursion into Kursk, one was under the impression that Kyiv was doing this to get an upper hand in any negotiations. But now with Moscow saying talks are off the table, where does it leave Ukraine?
Well, the Russians are playing a double game with the talks. Obviously, you see hardliners like Dmitry Medvedev consistently brand the Ukrainian government as an illegitimate regime that cannot be engaged in dialogue with. But you also see other Russian officials in the past, like Dmitry Peskov and even Vladimir Putin, as recently as June 14th, talk about the prospect of talks. But I don't think we should take a single isolated statement for Dmitry Medvedev as a sign that negotiations are impossible. I think that Ukraine, if it can make more gains in Kursk, is probably increasing the likelihood of future diplomacy.
How do Ukraine's NATO allies view this incursion?
Well, I think that it caught some NATO allies by surprise, and probably some others less by surprise. I think that there was obviously some coordination with the United States on this, at least coming from the statements from John Kirby. But the Germans, for example, were somewhat left in the dark. But even though the Germans may not have been consulted on very readily, they're also not objecting to the use of their weaponry on Russian soil. And it's very possible that when Ukraine was going to NATO countries and asking them for permission to use their weapons inside Russia, they were talking about it in the context of some kind of territorial incursion. So even if they didn't know about Kursk specifically, they probably knew that Ukraine was going to try to do some kind of a strike into Russia at some point.
But Samuel, I have a question. I thought the weapons were allowed to be used for defensive purposes. But is it considered defensive purposes if the weapons are being used on Russian territory?
Well, I think it can definitely be considered to be defensive. I mean, it depends on how you define defensive, and that might be defined very differently by Kiev and other NATO allies. If you're talking about trying to derail the Russian war machine and firing drones on what funds it, which is oil refineries, is perfectly legitimate. Taking drones on metallurgy factories would be perfectly legitimate. And Russia's occupying territory inside Ukraine with heavy fortifications that are hard to trespass. So to liberate your own territory, the only way forward might be to do a land swap deal, and Ukraine can frame that as defensive also. And Russia's also striking across the border in Sumy, which is right across the border from Kursk.
One could assume that Ukraine launched this incursion into Kursk before the winter sets in, but also before the presidential election in the United States. We don't know what's going to happen there. Yes, Kamala Harris is up in certain polls, but one never knows, right? Is there much of an appetite for this conflict to continue much longer and be settled just on the battlefield?
Well, I think that there probably is concern in Ukraine, obviously, about what a Trump presidency would mean, and the planning for this would have likely occurred long before August the 6th. So it probably was at a time when Trump was leading Joe Biden on average by about 5% in the polls, and he was talking about ending the war on day one. So I think that this defensive may have been done with that in mind, but regardless of who is president, there will very likely be, some kind of a division between Republicans in Congress and whoever's in the White House, even if Harris is there. And the Ukrainians need to show that this war is winnable to get more American support. And that's why they're doing this offensive too. Because I think over the past 18 months, when we saw the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive, when we saw Russia make incremental gains in Donetsk and places like Bakhmut and Chasiv, the feeling in Washington, amongst many, was that the war was not winnable. And now Ukraine has changed that paradigm potentially.
It seems to have changed the paradigm for now. I want to talk about something that's going to happen on Friday. We're going to have the Indian Prime Minister who's going to be going to Kyiv. His first visit, Narendra Modi's first visit to Ukraine since the conflict broke out, the first visit by an Indian leader to the country in some decades. Clearly, Modi will have to walk a very fine, tricky line because on one hand, New Delhi doesn't want to alienate Moscow. I mean, Modi was just in Russia last month hugging Vladimir Putin, and he also doesn't want to leave Kyiv out in the cold. What can we expect from that visit?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, India has definitely got a very delicate line to to thread. Obviously, India views Russia as one of its historical, all-weather, trustworthy partners. Even at times when the United States has supported Pakistan and China has been aggressive towards it. So it definitely does not want to do anything to blow its relationship with Russia. What I think the Modi will try to do when he visits Kiev will be, number one, try to assuage Ukrainian concerns about India's enabling of sanctions violations. There's a lot of concerns in Kiev, for example, right now about how European oil is simply being refined in India, and that Russian oil maybe is being refined in India and then being sold to Europe. And then the second thing would be to show that it is a contributor to a broader peace settlement and is a potential leader in terms of a global South peace solution that might be different from the solutions that China has proposed, which Ukraine sees as giving up too much territory, or South Africa and Africa has proposed, which have been criticized in a similar fashion.
Yeah, New Delhi actually says that Modi will be looking to discuss a resolution to the conflict. One wonders if that's going to be a diplomatic resolution, a negotiated resolution, given that Moscow says it's not willing to talk. We'll see how things pan out. Samuel, thank you very much for that. Samuel Ramani joining us there today.